So let's take a look at Games Workshop's latest update for some official 40k rankings. Which are the armies that they're ranking doing well and badly, and what are the issues that their design studio says it has in their crosshairs. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be fun to take a look at Games Workshop's latest chart of Warhammer 40k win rates. The first one that they've done with their Metawatch that revolves around the Arks of Omen. I think they did one a couple of weeks back that focused on the Las Vegas Open, which was interesting enough, but it did mean that in-depth analysis was a bit on the moot side, given by the time that they were talking about it we were already well into Arks of Omen, where half the rules in the game seem to have changed. Today I thought I'd just do a bit of a reaction to some of the things that they posted in their video, then talk briefly through their chart of army win rates, with the lowest to the highest ranked factions in 40k, at least by Games Workshop's measure. So for their article and video, this again was one of their installments in their Metawatch series. Really quite a nice series that they've been posting on Warhammer community, I think. It feels like a bit of an attitude shift in Games Workshop in general, where basically in the past they've kind of taken the line that they don't want to criticise their game in any way, even when they had kind of glaring issues, and these articles have just been a bit more realistic about things, admitting that yes, some factions are overtuned and some are underpowered, here's what we're thinking about doing about them, even though I think realistically, being an official source, they're never going to be too massively negative about things, as it's just not really in their interests. Perhaps the main content of the post this time was their army win rates in Arks of Omen, something that they admit is kind of in early days at the moment, and their big chart is made up of basically all tournament results, either big or small ones. The idea being not just to look at the absolute apex of the game, but to see what a bit more general people are playing as well, which I think is fair enough given their purposes. They're finally including numbers for the new Guard Codex, where previously they've been excluding them due to the Codex kind of not being officially out, just out in their launch box. But this one doesn't include any World Eaters rankings, their books only just come out, and they haven't been present in tournaments with their new rule set yet. They did mention that some armies in particular have some very small player bases, armies like Genestealer Cult, Deathwatch and Inari in particular. They haven't actually given us the sample sizes for the armies that they've been looking at, but given other datasets that does seem very likely. Those armies have pretty tiny player bases in general, so they're not going to have that much information on them in only a few weeks worth of tournament data. Overall though, given the win rates, they were broadly at least fairly happy with the current changes they made to 40k and Arks of Omen. It was really quite a seismic shift in the way that armies played, and honestly I would say that they haven't done too bad, given that a lot of their armies are sticking around about the 50% win rate mark. It is a lot better than a lot of times in 40k's history. Otherwise, I feel in these videos they maybe do tread over the same ground a few times. I think perhaps the main purpose of them is just to try and get the general community sort of in line with what they're trying to think about with these balance updates. So they did just talk about a bunch more topics in general terms that they've kind of covered before. Some discussion of internal balance and how an army should play, basically trying to make sure that the important and iconic units in the army are effective and not have some weird edge case build be the best thing that you can play as. I feel like that has been something that they've been generally trying to do for quite a while in 40k. In 8th edition we had things like horrendous Orc lists with 18 mech guns being one of the strongest ways to play them, or say nothing but Poxwalker Death Guard, and I feel like the 9th edition codexes have maybe been designed with an optimal way to play in mind, perhaps a bit more successful than they've been in the past admittedly. They talked about war gear changes as well, and whether people actually remodel all their armies for optimal loadouts. They did make the point that not everyone's just going to go out and cut up all their Space Marines and load them out with a different gear just because the rules have changed a bit, and that might genuinely have an impact on how some armies do if people have already modelled them certain ways. Might be a bit of a lag time with things like war gear changes, they were saying for things like Deathwatch in particular, though I do find it kind of interesting that they say that this isn't really something that we want people to have to go out and do every so often, though it might be kind of at odds with handing out massive amounts of free war gear in the first place. Flipping a faction's optimal loadout from something that was kind of bare bones to something that goes very heavy on all sorts of gear and trinkets just maybe seems like a bit of an odd statement when you've just flipped Space Marine war gear on its head and made just about everything free. It means that if you're taking a Space Marine Sergeant or something, you want to be loading them up with all sorts of crazy power weapons and combi weapons when it never really made sense to for the points in the past. They touched on a few other things, including saying that they do react to things like Reddit posts and stuff and keep an eye on that, as well as attend tournaments. And they did give us a rough sort of estimate as to the next balanced data slate. It will be coming as predicted in the next 3 months as per their usual release cycle around about Easter time. That's early April this year, so I guess you can expect it around about then before any sorts of major updates to 40k. If they go by their past precedent, I guess it would more be rules change than points changes. It's quite possible that we won't see any more points changes before 10th edition comes out. So far, they didn't really confirm any things that were definitely going to get looked at. They said they'd be keeping an eye on the armies that are outside of their ideal 45 to 55% win rate, and those are the armies that are most likely to attract attention in terms of either buffs or nerfs. Speaking of which, let's talk through their actual win rate charts. I have looked at a couple of similar kind of data sets myself on the channel over the past couple of weeks, and broadly speaking, I'd say there aren't really any major surprises compared with those ones. But with a bit more data, it does seem a few things have gone up or down kind of meaningfully. With armies with a lower win rate, we've got Deathwatch, Adeptus Mechanicus, Blood Angels, Adeptus Auroritas, Chaos Space Marines, and Thousand Sons, and also the combined numbers for Adeptus Astartes, which I believe will be the more Codex chapters, seeing as they have separated out other divergent chapters like Space Wolves, Deathwatch, and Dark Angels, though weirdly not Black Templars that I can see. In any case, Codex Space Marines overall seems to be at the bottom end of mid-tier, and based on the other stats breakdown that I looked at the other day from the Den of Fools people, Iron Hands were really carrying them quite hard, around about a 55% win rate. Salamanders and Black Templars were around about 47 to 49%, Ultramarines lower at around about 43%, and other chapters like Raven Guard, Imperial Fist, and White Scars just didn't really have enough players to draw any sort of meaningful conclusions, though generally had win rates quite low. Perhaps a slightly surprising spread from armies using the same base codex, but obviously not too hard to see why Iron Hands are doing well with all-game Devastator Doctrine re-rolling those ones on their heavy weapons. On paper they are just one of the strongest chapters for a whole bunch of units in the codex. Otherwise, Deathwatch seemed to be by far the worst overall, with 36% compared with 44% at AdMech. Again, on other numbers, Deathwatch have had spectacularly low play rates in Arks of Omen, very few people choosing to run them. I think it would only take a few players doing well with them to boost those numbers significantly, but at least in theory they do have some pretty big issues. Their Deathwatch veterans maybe compare a little bit poorly to things like Stern Guard for the points that they cost. The doctrine changes haven't really helped them out, as they use their mission tactics, so didn't really get any changes there. Plus their Kill Team Strike Force Army of Renown went out of date as well, and that was one of the stronger ways to play them. Even if they do start doing a bit better, it still seems pretty clear that they're towards the bottom of the meta. AdMech seem to be ranked here a little bit lower compared with other ratings that I've seen. Kinda surprising they still seem to be at the very bottom of 40k's rankings despite their massive buffs. Admittedly, a 44% win rate is better than the 38% or so they had last season, but still are struggling more than most. Otherwise, Blood Angels recently won the Las Vegas Open and have won 2 grand tournaments in Arks of Omen, but in general still seem to be doing pretty badly in terms of general players' win rates. Armour of Contempt definitely had a factor there, seeing as Death Company and Sanguinary Guard don't get invuls, and it really was a big durability boost to them. Sisters have definitely fallen right down from the upper 50s due to the Armour of Contempt loss, plus no points changes to compensate. Kind of similar for Chaos Space Marines, including nerfs to Creations of Bile and other key units. And Thousand Sons, again, I was kind of expecting to be down at this sort of place. Armour of Contempt going without any significant points changes really wasn't great news for them. Again, with Chaos Space Marines, it does seem that there's big variations between the different legions. The most played ones at the moment seem to be Black Legion, Emperor's Children, and Word Bearers. They all seem to be doing kind of fine, perhaps Word Bearers rising a bit up the rankings compared with the others, given increased costs for Marcus Slanesh and Abaddon, which had hit the first two. Moving on, we've got a whole bunch of armies that have got pretty middling win rates, everything from 48 to 50%. I think Games Workshop will be pretty pleased with overall. Here we've got Leagues of Votan, Aziani, so your Craftworld Eldar there, Tau Empire, Grey Knights, Tyranids, Necrons, Space Wolves, Imperial Knights, Drukhari, and Death Guard. It's good to see both Grey Knights and Death Guard doing okay-ish here. I was kind of apprehensive that even with the points changes they might have been in the lower tier of this, but they seem to be doing kind of fine. Imperial Knights are perhaps a little bit lower than I was expecting. They were one of the stronger armies last season, and the changes broadly worked out kind of well for them. I suppose fairly good numbers playing the new Guard Codex, Leagues of Votan, and Chaos Demons probably doesn't help them too much, plus Chaos Knights gained a fair bit in comparison to them. Kind of interesting to see Leagues of Votan doing quite so well here as well. Seems that Judgment Token Death still seems to be holding its own, despite even more of their decent units going up more in points this update. I guess being the only faction with an Armour of Contempt equivalent probably helps them out a bit. Now a lot more people might be using AP-1 guns. Otherwise, Crash Worlds are seeming fine, a lot of lists using either Ulthway or Hail of Doom. Tau lists maybe swapping Sun Sharks for a few more Riptides and things. It's kind of hilarious to see Tyranids still hitting a 50% win rate despite even more catastrophic nerfs. And Necrons seem to have taken a hit, but are still in the running. I feel like it was probably a healthy change for the faction overall, not to get quite so many auto-win objectives, but have a whole bunch of their units get a decent buff in-game. Moving onwards and upwards, here are the armies that are busting out of 50%, but are still within Games Workshop's 45 to 55% targets. Harlequins and Inari both seem to be doing pretty darn well. Both of these armies tend to have pretty tiny player bases though, and I'd say are on average maybe played by a few more competitive players than casual. Again, Harlequins don't seem to have been hit too hard by their invul save being toned down, their mobility carrying them through. Demons, I'm kind of interested to see ranked so low. On most other rankings, I've seen them doing rather better than this, a bit more up in the 57-58% sort of bracket as opposed to down here. I certainly feel like in some of their more competitive forms, they're one of the scariest armies in the game right now. I definitely wouldn't underestimate them in this bracket. Kind of nice to see Orcs doing solidly as well. They do seem to be an upper mid-tier army fairly firmly now, at least when using their top units. The buff to knobs helped them out quite a bit, plus AP-1 doing well just generally is pretty good for their choppers and plenty of other weapons. Chaos Knights seem to have gained a fair bit on their Imperial counterparts, perhaps partly due to secondary objectives and things, and Garda remaining fairly solid in the upper mid-tier, not one of the very top factions of the game, but pretty fearsome shooting and seem to have the tools to do well. Finally, when we get into the very apex of the meta, here we've got the armies that Games Workshop are rating to be a bit too strong by their own mechanisms, win rates of 56% plus, and here we've got the Adeptus Custodes, Dark Angels, and the Genestealer cults taking the top spot. I think for this bracket I would mention Iron Hands as well. If they separated out the Space Marine chapters, then Iron Hands would be around this kind of level. I've seen them on numbers anywhere between 54% and 60%. I think sometimes it makes sense to lump Space Marine armies all together, but I feel like at the moment there is a bit of a disparity between them and everyone else. I guess it would have been kind of helpful to see their numbers on this chart. Otherwise, absolutely no surprise to see Adeptus Custodes here, 56%, winning multiple major events, placing very highly, and just generally being all around strong. Lots of helpful changes for them, including Space Marines in general being more popular, who they tend to kill quite well. Wardens and Terminators getting their objectives secured back, and both are being very popular units. Better stratagems, cheaper Sisters of Silence, and it has culminated in them being the most competitively played faction at the moment, unless you lump literally every single Space Marine chapter in together. I'd guess that these numbers might actually be understating how strong they are as well, as compared with just about every army in the game bar perhaps Space Marines, they're one of the easiest armies to jump into and collect, particularly having received a very nice Christmas Battle Force box recently, and I feel like that's probably attracted a bunch of new players who might be playing them at a bit more of a basic level. Probably not an enormous dilutional effect, but I wouldn't be too surprised if they were perhaps a little bit harder to access, they might be a percentage point or two higher. Otherwise, Dark Angels, again absolutely no surprises to see here. Kinda like the Iron Hands, they're just arguably the best Space Marines for a whole bunch of units within the Codex. The Raven Wing are awesome with their Devastator doctrine, giving you massive movement and invul saves all game long. Talon Master for shooting is pretty ferocious with AP-2 as well. Then to hold objectives and be a tough anvil to remove, there's the Deathwing Terminators. Take a whole bunch with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields and some Cyclone missile launchers, and you've just got a ridiculously efficient bully unit to hold down the midfield. Finally, and perhaps an interesting twist, we've got Genestealer cults on top this week. Again, as with Harlequins and Inari, I would bear in mind that Genestealer cult player base is very low compared with most armies. I'd say the margin for error on their win rate is going to be higher than just about any of the rest, though admittedly they did do kind of well in last week's tournament, taking down a couple of medium-sized events. Arks of Omen gave them a solid power boost, and they were kind of alright before. I feel like they are an army that if a bunch of newer players suddenly jump onto the faction seeing good results though, then things are probably going to swing back the other way. Perhaps compared with quite a lot of factions in the game, Genestealer cults do have a reputation for being a hard army to play. Lots of fragile units and options with how you play them. If you make a big mistake and things wind up dead or failing in their alpha strike, then it can be incredibly punishing and hard to come back for from there. Despite a slightly higher win rate, I probably wouldn't realistically rank them higher than things like Dark Angels, Custodians and Iron Hands, but they will be truly terrifying in someone who's played them inside out for a long time and has really mastered every trick that they have and what they do in lots of situations. Still though, certainly great news for the worshippers of the Four-Armed Emperor. By these numbers, they're certainly one of the stronger factions in 40k. Anyway, let me know what you think of the numbers. Always interesting to get a little bit of data and some insights as to how Games Workshop's looking at 40k as a whole. How much do you agree that these win rates show what's strong and weak in 40k at the moment, and would you expect them to stay like this going forward? If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with 40k's news and releases, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I do try and keep up with Games Workshop's rules and things, posting new 40k videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.